I have never in my life as a journalist seen so many judges that are trying to block a sitting president, trying to avoid lawsuit and jail time themselves, and helping gang members to avoid the legal repercussions. To help me go through some of these big stories, I have Judge Joe Brown. Judge Brown, thank you so much for joining me again.
All right, sir. My pleasure.
So I saw that Leticia James, she is now making a move. I want to do a 10,000-foot view of what's going on, but let me zoom in just quickly for a second. She has now hired the same lawyer as Hunter Biden while claiming that she's completely innocent of mortgage fraud, that she's completely innocent of raising the valuation of her property in order to get better loans, lying on applications about how many rental properties she has in order to secure better financing. And she says, I never said my primary residence was in Virginia. That's how I'm able to remain the Attorney General of New York. What are your thoughts on the Leticia James situation and her hiring Hunter Biden's lawyer?
Well, lawyers are lawyers, and if you want to hire somebody that you feel confident in, fine. What we need to watch out for this is she paying the lawyer's fee, or is she trying to bamboozle the citizens of New York again so they wind up paying it? They shouldn't, because this is personal to her and has absolutely nothing to do with official duties. Also, in my long experience dealing with the criminal law, I would say that, this old thing they used to have in the old time movies, the crook always returns to the scene of the crime. Well, I never really particularly found that to be true, but I did find that the people that were trying to implicate somebody else in crime tended to implicate people falsely for doing what they themselves were doing because perhaps they understood it. So when I read what they were trying to do or are doing in investigating Leticia James, I said, oh, if you took the name away, you would think she was talking about President Trump and what she went after him for. So it's like, oh, that seems very familiar to me. Now, of course, there are allegations, and under American law, you're innocent until you're proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. But it does look like there is probable cause to get deeper into it. And the lawyer that dealt with Hunter Biden, well, let's just put it this way. Hunter Biden got pardoned, a general blanket pardon from his daddy. And had that not been the case, I think what should have gone on was prosecution for Foreign Agents Registration Act violations, which are clear and succinct. And an interesting thing about that is I'm waiting for the feds to bring in Hunter Biden not as a suspect, but as a witness who cannot exercise the Fifth Amendment because he has no liability and he can tell on all his friends. Now, I did something for Fox about 3 years ago, and we got to look at the three, not one, but three Hunter Biden laptops. And we interviewed the technician, swore him in, and we got to take our leisure to go through what's on those laptops. And let me just say this. There is enough on there to indict former President Biden when he was acting as vice president. There's enough to bring in and question Barack Obama, president of the United States. Hillary Clinton is implicated in that, and a lot of other people that are in front of the media. And I can just hardly wait until some enterprising U.S. attorney for some appropriate district starts looking at that and brings in Hunter Biden and puts him under oath, and he can't exercise the Fifth Amendment since he has no liability, and he can tell on all his friends and associates and all of those people that he exchanged emails with that are reflected on those three laptops. So it ought to be interesting. And what we had under the Biden-Harris administration was a pointed effort by the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Attorney General of the United States to ignore what was obvious criminality and exercise prosecutorial discretion, which is essentially absolute in the United States, to decline to go after these individuals that were implicated. Now, there's another methodology that I also would love to see put in place, and that is that a grand jury does not have to be convened by a prosecutorial authority. If it is already in place, it can act on its own and return articles that result in prosecution. That's generally called a presentment. So, in other words, you can have a district attorney's or a U.S. attorney's office convene or ask to have a grand jury convened, present information to that grand jury, and try to get an approval for a bill of indictment. But the grand jury, once convened, can act independently on its own, call its own witnesses, and return what is known as a presentment. And that is in those instances where the prosecutorial authority itself, aka, for example, Leticia James, is in fact involved, so you can bypass the necessity of having a prosecutorial authority work against itself. And then you can have appointments of special prosecutors, and we ought to have those, and the I's ought to be dotted and T's crossed.
Okay. You mentioned something. Is she going to pay this out of pocket, or is she going to stick the taxpayer? This says New York AG's office hires Hunter Biden's lawyer. I get the feeling she's preparing to stick the people of New York with
That's
this.
right. And that's totally inappropriate because that's got absolutely nothing to do with our official duties. And somebody in New York a group of people ought to bring a taxpayer suit to prohibit her from using the state furnished funds for personal purposes. That, by the way, is criminality if it comes out. So she's in effect ignorantly committing another crime. And one thing that I do not understand is her as Attorney General for the state of New York, along with the likes of, let's say, Fannie Willis down in Fulton County, Georgia, meaning Atlanta, being so ignorant of the law that they're supposed to uphold as chief law enforcement authority in their respective jurisdictions. Fannie Willis did one of the dumbest stunts I've ever seen in my 50 plus year career in this field when it comes to failing to take into context the Fifth Amendment. And we're about to see, I predict, the same thing with Leticia James. Too often we have DEI positions that occupy the U.S. Attorney's Office or the Attorney General's office somewhere, and we don't have the level of competence and capacity that you would expect. I think the American public got a shocking wake-up period, for example, looking at Fannie Willis or Leticia James, and instead of the prosecutorial authorities being very learned, wise, and dignified, as per 30 years, 40 years worth of television programs where you got to look at the DA, you saw foolish, loudmouth, political appointees who were DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, rather than dealing with somebody just because of their expertise. And it's a rampant thing in the whole legal community right now, from judgeships, appellate court justices, all the way down to entry-level attorneys. There are so many lawyers now and so many people that are beneficiaries of a new thing all across the educational system, where you do not want to be rigorous and vigorous in what you expect of a student, but you don't want to get in the way of someone's dreams. So you have rookies sitting in places they don't need to be. We've got attorney generals I've been exposed to who literally couldn't find the criminal justice system to be sworn in because they'd never been there before. We have new attorney generals who've never practiced criminal law. They may have been a law professor, perhaps, but they've never been in the trenches. We have judges sitting on very heavy trial law benches where they manage juries, death penalties go through them, unlimited jurisdiction through civil cases, and they have no trial experience. We have people, I mean, as lawyers, not necessarily as judge. So you have a judge who's never had 2, 3, or 4 trials as an attorney. We have people that are pushed to the public as experts in civil rights, and they've never had a jury trial in their career. And that is effectively the same as somebody being a physician, having a medical office, holding up his shingle, being licensed, and then you find out that that person has never done an internship or a residency. It's kind of absurd, but I'm seeing a lot of that. And we even have things like the state of Washington saying that lawyers no longer have to take a bar and pass it, which is ridiculous considering the general level of incompetence that I have seen across the board. I would make one suggestion. She might be better off if she can't afford an attorney having the public defender's office, because with scant exception, many of the private practitioners of law are not as good as the public defenders just because they don't have that experience level. They've had 3, 4, and 5 trials max, and that's supposed to make you an experienced private trial lawyer. Whereas you might have the public defender that is assigned to you who has 35, 40, 50 trials under his or her belt, and a lot of investigative resources that the ordinary person does not have, so, or can afford. And this thing here, where you have prosecutorial authorities or governmental officials who have been accused of personal individual wrongdoing, are getting away with having the taxpayers foot their attorney bills. And I think that's wrong. And the bar associations involved, the ethics committees thereof, ought to be jumping into the midst of this and saying, oh, foul play. The citizens ought to do this, and the news entities ought to roast them, because it's like, hey, this is not in line with your public duties. This is your individual stuff. So this is not appropriate for you to self-appoint counsel who will be paid for by the citizens, who are in fact likely to be the plaintiffs against you for your wrongdoing. That doesn't work that way.
I have to imagine Hunter Biden has failed to pay those attorneys. So maybe this is an opportunity for them to milk the New York taxpayer and get some of that political money back. But let me ask you this.
It's advertisement. A good lawyer takes controversial cases and he whips behind on them at trial, not so much in terms of settlement, but at trial. And that's how he gets his reputation. That could be Johnny Cochran, F. Lee Bailey, myself, or whatever. You get in there, you hit the trenches, and you get in front of juries and you perform. And when you do that, there you go. And by the way, if you want a good example of what lawyers, especially young ones, do when they're trying to set up, I will recommend a series to everybody, and it's a peculiar one. Marvel, through Disney, has a series called Daredevil. The individual's blind, but he's a trial attorney, and his partner's one too. They're brand new, and you see the changes that they go through, and they do have acumen and an aptitude for it, and you can see how this thing works. Another one, if you can bring up on your cable setup, watch Al Pacino in Justice for All, and that is actually a pretty real representation of how it works in the real system, in the trials and travails that trial lawyers actually go through, if they are deserving of that term.
Okay, interesting. Let me pull this up on the screen. Leticia James is now saying this entire case being brought against her is nothing but a Trump revenge tour, that there's no truth to the mortgage fraud accusations, and that this is Donald Trump calling on his goons to take her out. But I've interviewed the people that have been looking into this. They're an independent journalist, they're a private investigator, they're a filmmaker, and they're somebody that likes Trump but isn't connected to Trump. Is she just using this as a bulletproof vest. Oh, the president's after me because I went after him. Your thoughts?
This is typical of those who try to hide behind a claimed victim status. See, what knocks this whole thing out of the box is there is this thing called a grand jury. And if a grand jury chooses to intervene and indict, Trump has nothing to do with it because Trump's not in that grand jury room. If somebody gets brought before the criminal justice system that way, that just falls out of the picture. And by the way, it sounds very hypocritical for somebody who has been one of the primary practitioners of what we call lawfare, that is, violating the Bill of Rights, to use the awesome power of the state or the U.S. government to go persecute some individual who's in political or social disfavor. It is very disingenuous for them to be involved in the exact same thing and start talking about independent agencies that have no connection with Donald Trump, have not met with Donald Trump, to holler, I'm a victim because I'm trying to maintain the hypocrisy of saying I can do this to others, but it can't come back to me. See, that's the problem.
Okay.
So it's just a DEI thing, that victim mentality bit where you pay not only lip service, you hide, as you say, behind a very transparent shield that puts you up as, I'm a victim, everybody's dumping on me. No, when you did this, there was nobody you had to answer to, because under the law that you operated under, you are the chief, or you were the chief prosecuting official for this particular state entity. So there was nobody you were answerable to except the people that elected you and the court system that not prosecutes, but deals with administering the consequences of what you put in place. So what goes around comes around, and sauce for the goose is sauce for the gander, so to speak.
Okay. You and I talked about this off camera, but we've got this judge in Milwaukee who basically intervened on behalf of an illegal immigrant, somebody who was deported but hiding in the country. They've now learned this. Can you help my audience understand what's going on with this judge and why it was so wrong?
Okay, what they have is a long-standing federal law, the United States Code annotated as part of the criminal codes of the United States. It's Title 8, Section 1324, that makes harboring, aiding and abetting, giving comfort, assisting in avoiding apprehension or detention or deportation, giving food, shelter, this kind of thing, setting up a sanctuary city, irrespective of your official capacity, and it's a felony. And we have many that are doing it openly, and they've been relying upon the forbearance of the prosecutorial authority under the Biden-Harris administration that now has evaporated, so they're going to get caught up in this. So what we have here is an allegation that one judge in particular assisted this particular illegal alien who is in the country illegally avoid or evade being apprehended by ICE. And we also have another one where a judge just got arrested yesterday because the judge took the defense lawyer and the defendant in question, who was wanted by ICE and who had an outstanding warrant for his arrest, allegedly escorted the two individuals, the lawyer and the suspect, out of the side door of the court, down a private hallway so they could escape apprehension. So that judge has been taken into custody, and that's appropriate. Now, someone is innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, but that's certainly sufficient to establish probable cause. And I'm anxious to see Title 8, Section 1325 applied, because I actually had a lot of trials 45 years ago under those provisions, harboring federal fugitives. That was as a defense lawyer. So it's time that we applied the law across the board. and we settled out some of this stuff that is an abomination to our constitutional government. That is using the process of the state, the criminal process, to oppress, suppress, and generally embarrass or get rid of inconveniences that are not amenable to the standardized and legal ways of dealing with them. In other words, the voters aren't turning them out of office. They have their First Amendment rights to advocate what they want to do, but you use the criminal process to persecute them. We can't have that, because that's why we have the Bill of Rights, and every single one of these, I call them scumbags, who wants to sit there and pervert our fundamental constitutional rights, and who has a sworn obligation to uphold that Constitution. I think they are as bad as any criminals out there in the street who is trying to do some crime to hurt the general citizenry. This is worse, because it is the kind of thing that hurts many, many people at one fell stroke rather than just one or two at a time.
Okay. Yeah. There was also this judge. You kind of alluded to this out in New Mexico, but he's been making judgments on illegal immigrants, MS-13 gang members, and then it turns out that he and his wife have been putting them up in a rental property and receiving money for, I guess they get it from either drugs or the government, and then he gets his rent payment. He and his wife have now been arrested. Is this aiding and abetting, avoiding ICE, or why would he be I know it's bad, but why would he be arrested?
Well, not only that, it's also unethical. It is exploiting the people, and I won't speculate because I don't know what the charges are, but I can perceive of a number of criminal acts that would come in additionally to those that would be under Chapter 8, Section 1324, that deals with harboring federal fugitives and attempting to give aid and comfort, etc., to them. So that's the kind of thing that, if proven, can result in your law license getting snatched and getting removed from the bench, in addition to being criminally prosecuted, if the judge had an undisclosed personal interest in the outcome of the matter before him. That's what you got with another one of those things in New York, where the judge in question, with the supposed paying hush money alleged to have been performed by President Trump, had a wife and a daughter who had a vested interest in the outcome, and that is also unethical. And I'm wondering why the New York bar has not gotten in on reviewing that judge's law license and status for doing that. And in addition, I'm predicting that particular conviction is not going to stand. That's the one with the supposed 34 counts, because when you get into it, the judge not only violated his ethical responsibilities to the public and to the system of justice, but we have a peculiar thing in that he refused to give an appropriate charge to the jury, which is basically, if somebody is trying to suppress a crime by paying a bribe to somebody and there is no crime, what happens is that bribe, to not embarrass him, is actually the payoff on a blackmail attempt. So your crime defendant is actually the victim of a blackmail attempt, and the person that you used as your witness to prosecute that person should have been prosecuted for blackmail under your law. So we're seeing a lot of that has been given a wing and a nod to, that should not exist in our system, and it has set up some very bad habits. The time period, 4 or 5 years that this has gone on, is that time period where young lawyers spend their 3 years going through law school and getting their doctorates of law and coming out with the wrong idea about how this works. That's not the way it's supposed to be. And I think people need to put a stop to it so that we can return this country to an even keel.
Okay. Um, a lot of chatter on the internet among independents and also Republicans is these lower district courts determining the national direction that a U.S. sitting president wants to go. I want to bring up on the screen here. This is a judge that people are now digging into deeply, that they're finding has ties to sanctuary cities. This is an Obama Judge William Orrick III, nominated by Obama, raised money for Obama, has donated money to Democrat groups, on and on and on. You start digging in, you start finding connections to Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, Dianne Feinstein. It goes on and on and on. Should judges be able to donate money to political parties? They are citizens of the United States, after all, but does it in fact open them up to bias, or at least in a court case to say, aha, you're biased, you're now blocking Trump, who's a Republican, because there's a money trail of you supporting Democrats?
It depends on where these donations came from and when they occurred. When they're on the bench, other than just donating to a political party generally, they would be totally inappropriate. Now, one of the things that you have here is there's another thing about how dare an appointed judge interfere with an elected president. Well, the precedent follows from Marbury versus Madison, 1803, which is 222 years ago. And it deals with what we call Section 3, Article 3 judges. The Constitution only details the U.S. Supreme Court, but reserves for Congress the authority to establish lesser courts and select the judges therefore. Now, those courts sort of vet things that work up to the U.S. Supreme Court. And I have to be candid with this one. They have the authority to do just what they do. The authority may not be exercised with wisdom or discernment, and that's why we have appellate courts that let these things percolate up until they get to the U.S. Supreme Court, if the U.S. Supreme Court chooses to hear a particular matter. But I would offer this relative to the Second Amendment. I'm a strong supporter of the Second Amendment, and I think it says what it says, and it's absolute, and it guarantees all the rest of our liberty and freedom. So it's very important. And a certain Texas district court judge was very wise, I think, when he enjoined the Biden-Harris administration from a cockamamie effort by ATF under their direction to deal with banning pistol braces. They had long allowed this because we have many returning veterans who have made a lot of sacrifices for our country, and they have disabilities. So the brace was to allow them with their physical handicaps as a result of war injuries and such like, and other people similarly situated to be able to defend themselves. So the Biden administration, through an executive order or two, and through its influence on ATF, decided to ban long permitted pistol braces, and it's caused a lot of grief, and it exposes quite a few million Americans to being prosecuted as a felony. Well, as a felon. So what happened is the district court judge down in Texas says, no, that's unconstitutional. You can't do it. So the Biden administration appealed that. And as I understand it, the Trump administration is going to dismiss the appeal because essentially they agree with what the district court judge did. Now, the judges have jurisdiction, and whether or not they exercise it with wisdom and discernment is a different issue. That's why we have this thing, because we have various circuits in the United States, and we have conflicting decisions by these circuit court panels of justices, and what happens is they will, because of the differences, demonstrate to the U.S. Supreme Court that the ultimate legal authority in the United States, the Supreme Court, involve itself to set guidance standards for the rest of the country as to what the law is. So the district court judge does have the authority and the jurisdiction to make these rulings, to make these injunctions. And we really need to be careful, because sometimes we applaud them and sometimes we castigate them. But they do have the authority, though it may not be exercised wisely or in an appropriate fashion. So the system is what it is. It's been working for 200 and, let's see, the Constitution was ratified in 1789, so that's 236 years. And it has worked quite well, and we ought to keep our faith in that system's ability to work. It's probably the best in the world, and let it work, even if we don't like the outcome. Like they say in Star Wars, what is it that Obi-Wan told Luke? Padawan, patience is a great virtue, and that is what we have to deal with.
Yeah. Okay. Final question here. What do you think is going to come out of the Supreme Court if they decide to take up this idea of birthright citizenship? You've got some people saying this shouldn't be applied to illegals who come here, have a baby, and then basically get their toe in the door, and now they and their families are allowed to come to the country. I saw somebody else on the Democrat side the other day say, well, this was originally to ensure that black slaves were made citizens of the United States. However, now, if you don't let a bunch of illegals come in, it's actually racist towards black Americans. That made no sense to me, because illegals taking jobs that a black American should have, or a place in a school should have, or whatever it is, to me, that seems unfair. What do you think is going to come out of this birthright citizenship trial?
I can see points on each side, but I think the Trump administration has the strongest side. And one of the things that will be looked at is the legislative intent that resulted in the formulation of the 14th Amendment that was submitted to and ratified by the various states after the Civil War. What happened was, at that point, Dred Scott, which is one of the lousiest, most ill-advised decisions the U.S. Supreme Court has ever come up with, which to a great extent precipitated the U.S. Civil War, 1861 to 65, was still the effective law of the United States of America. So what the 14th Amendment did with this birthright citizenship is undo what Dred Scott did. Dred Scott said a Negro, a former slave or otherwise, could not be a citizen of the United States of America, and therefore a lot of the laws that applied and protected citizens did not apply to Negroes. So what the constitutional amendment did was declare that if you were born here, which was essentially the circumstances of just about every former slave at that point, which was not quite 60 years removed from the sanction that was put in place in the Constitution to end the importation of slavery circa 1806, 1808. You essentially didn't have anybody left alive in the country that had not been born here, who had been in the status of being a slave, or who was a Negro. It also specifically was applicable to Native Americans / American Indians / Amerins. And that is what is clear in the long debated, long recorded dialogue about what the 14th Amendment was to be for. So I can see one of the strong points that has always been inherent when you review the constitutionality or appropriateness of a statute or an application is to look at the legislative history. So I think the legislative history is going to say this was not intended for somebody who illegally crashed the borders of the country, was in a criminal status, particularly under Title 8, Section 1324, and had a child so that they could evade the application of the criminal law. And I think that's going to be the strong point if they do it. Now, I don't know what the legal tactics and strategy is going to be for the Trump administration's Justice Department, but I can see that their position is, in fact, a strong one. And I really don't think that anybody, when they came up with the 14th Amendment, wanted to say we could have an illegal invasion of the southern border or the northern one and allow people to come in and, by this technicality, acquire an anchor. So even if they aren't citizens, they can't be deported for humanitarian reasons, and bring in these other individuals who will become citizens. Now, the contrary thing, the opposition goes on. If these children are citizens, technically under the American law, is we could foster them and deport the parents if we weren't concerned with the humanitarian aspects of the thing. And we have another human resource that when they arrive at 18, if we reinstate the draft, could be drafted and put into the armed services after they're taken out of a foster situation. But you see, there is that. So, two sides, and I'm not getting paid for it. So,
Okay, well, we'll see. We'll see what ends up coming out of it. Sir, I want to thank you for taking time out of your day to come on. There's always so many legal stories, and I always think to myself, I wonder what Judge Joe Brown thinks about this particular story. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm going to put your direct X account link down below so people can follow you,
and
as well as...
Summer's coming up, and I've got a barbecue product line that I think is the best out there, Judge Joe Brown Barbecue. And the initials Judge Joe Brown, JJB, and barbecue, BPQ. If you add a .com to it, you can go to our website and you can get the product. And if you have an Amazon account, you can order it from Amazon. And if you have Amazon Prime, you get it in 2 days and you don't have to pay for the shipping. We have mild and spicy sauce and seasoning, powder, and we have chicken links, raw and smoked, mild and spicy beef links, and something that is very interesting beyond meat, that vegetarian stuff that tastes just like meat. And if you are a vegetarian, you can do it. It's qualified as health food. Whole Foods, Sprouts, and such like in some parts of the country do have it on their shelves, and it's been winning a lot of taste tests. Try it. Judge Joe Brown Barbecue.
Okay.
My collaborator is one of Beyonce's personal chefs, and that's Chef Damon. And also Tiffany Haddish, the comedian, is one of our investors, and she pushes it too. And we've got Dr. Cheyenne Bryant, one hell of a clinical psychologist who, by the way, does some interesting things in terms of keeping the government straight. So we've got a good American crew that is pushing a good product. So try it. JJBBBQ.com.
Okay. I'm going to put that direct link so that people can find it easily. Thank you so much for coming on. I hope you have a great